The private dining room at Auberge du Sommet in downtown Vancouver was the kind of place that made people speak in lower voices the moment they stepped inside, not because the management required it, because the room itself demanded it. The hand-laid marble floors, the single orchid on every table, the way candlelight hit the crystal decanters just so, turning ordinary wine into something that looked like it had been poured from a sunset. The staff moved like ghosts, trained to appear only when needed and dissolve into the background the rest of the time. Dara Finnegan had been dissolving into backgrounds for 3 years. She was 29 years old, tall enough that she had to remember to angle her shoulders when passing between close-set tables, with the kind of quiet face that people described later as composed when they were being generous and hard to read when they weren't. She wore her dark hair pinned back in the regulation style, low, smooth, professional. Her uniform was pressed, her shoes were polished, and somewhere behind those careful eyes was a woman who had once read Yoon Chang-ho's papers on transnational corporate law at 3 in the morning because she genuinely could not put them down. That was a different life. Tonight, the dining room held one table of importance. Table 7. The far corner, semi-circular booth, screened from the rest of the room by a panel of frosted glass etched with willow branches. It had been reserved for a group of 4 under the name Hardcastle Developments Limited, and Thierry Bachon, the maître, a compact man who ran the floor like a Swiss watch, had pulled Dara aside before service to give her the briefing. "The party includes Yeon-ju Oh," he said quietly, "Korean, CEO of GH Meridian Group. She's considering a significant partnership with Hardcastle. This is their pitch dinner." He paused. "I'm told she travels without an entourage." No translator listed. Dara had kept her expression perfectly still. "Understood. Just keep the table smooth. That's all I need from you." She'd nodded and gone back to folding napkins. She did not mention that she had spent 2 years in Seoul on a full academic scholarship, or that she had passed an advanced proficiency exam in Korean with the second highest score in her cohort. She did not mention any of that because Thierry had not asked, and because, in the world of Auberge du Sommet, her job was to keep the table smooth. The Hardcastle party arrived at 7:15. First came the 2 men. Brent Aldous walked ahead, the way men do when they've decided they own a room before entering it. He was 50-something. Broad-shouldered, with a grey suit that cost more than Dara's monthly salary and the kind of permanent tan that came not from outdoor work but from regular weekends in Scottsdale. His partner, younger, quieter, with quick eyes that scanned the room before his expression settled into something resembling ease, was introduced in the reservation notes as Colin Farr, VP of Acquisitions. Then came Yeon-ju Oh. She was smaller than Dara had expected. That was always the first thing people noticed and immediately felt guilty about noticing, the gap between someone's power and their physical presence. Yeon-ju Oh was perhaps 5'2", dressed in a charcoal suit with a single thin gold pin at the lapel. Her posture was exact, not stiff, not rigid. Exact, the way a person carries themselves when they have spent their whole life deciding precisely how much space they are entitled to take up. She looked around the dining room once, briefly, with dark eyes that recorded everything, and then she sat down and folded her hands on the table, and waited. She said nothing in English, not a greeting, not a thank you when Dara placed the menu in front of her. She looked at the pages for a moment, then set the menu aside and looked at Aldous with quiet expectation. Aldous smiled the smile of a man who had misread that look entirely. "She's a woman of few words," he said to Farr, not bothering to lower his voice. "That's fine. Let the numbers do the talking." Dara refilled the water glasses. She did not look up. The dinner began. Dara moved through the routine. Bread service, The amuse-bouche, taking the orders, Aldous ordered for the table without consulting Yeon-ju Oh, which he managed by pointing at items on the menu and looking at her for a nod she gave only because she was too polished to cause a scene. The sommelier came and went. The kitchen sent out the first course, and through it all, Yeon-ju Oh watched and listened and said almost nothing. But Dara noticed something the men had entirely missed. Yeon-ju Oh's eyes moved differently when Aldous spoke. A very slight narrowing. Not confusion. Not blankness. Assessment. The careful, deliberate processing of a person who understands more than she's showing. She understands some of it, Dara thought, reaching across to collect an empty bread plate. Maybe more than some. At the 20-minute mark, Aldous opened his leather portfolio. He slid a document across the table, 16 pages, bound in Navy card stock. The Harcastle proposal. "We'll walk her through it," Aldous said to Farr. "Keep it simple. Just the numbers." Dara positioned herself near the service credenza, just close enough to be available, just far enough to be invisible. Standard technique. She watched Farr begin to point out figures on the first page, and then she heard Aldous lean toward Farr and say, very quietly but not quietly enough, "She won't read the schedules anyway. They never do." Farr didn't respond, but his jaw tightened slightly. Dara picked up a clean cloth and began polishing a serving fork that did not need polishing. The main courses arrived. Dara made 3 trips from the kitchen, the seared halibut for Yeon-ju Oh, which she had managed to communicate through a combination of pointing, and Dara's careful intervention. "The halibut is excellent this evening. The rack of lamb for Aldous. The mushroom risotto for Farr." She worked quickly and quietly, and she did not think about the paper she had written in her 3rd year at UBC on fiduciary obligations in cross-border acquisition contracts, a paper her professor had described as the clearest thinking I've seen from an undergraduate in a decade. She did not think about that because it did not belong here. The conversation at table 7 had shifted. Aldous was walking Yeon-ju Oh through the financial projections, using the slow, slightly too loud delivery of a person speaking to someone they've decided can't fully understand them. His Korean was non-existent. His body language was filling in the gap in all the wrong ways. But then he said something that made Dara's hand go still on the side of the credenza. The exclusivity clause on page 9 locks in the Western Canada portfolio for 7 years. We've worded it so the exit penalties look minor on the surface. She'll see a number in the low 6 figures, but the actual cost of early termination is closer to $45 million once you factor in the subsidiary clauses on pages 12 and 13. Standard practice. They never read that far. He said it in the easy, slightly bored tone of a man saying something he has said many times. Farr said nothing. He moved a piece of lamb around his plate. Dara did not move. She stood at the credenza, and she felt something happen behind her ribs. Not shock exactly, because she had not been naive enough to be shocked by men like Aldous since she was 22. It was something more specific. A kind of cold clarity. The knowledge that she was the only person in the room, other than Yeon-ju Oh, who understood what had just been said. And that Yeon-ju Oh had not been meant to understand it. And that Yeon-ju Oh's company, 400 employees, according to the reservation brief Thierry had shared, might be made to absorb a $45 million exit penalty on a contract she was being walked through in a language she was never expected to fully follow. Dara looked at the water pitcher in her hands. She looked at table 7. She looked at the door to the kitchen. She thought about her mother, who was 3 months into her 2nd round of treatment at Vancouver General. She thought about the fact that she had picked up a Sunday branch shift this weekend to cover the copay. She thought about what Thierry had said. Keep the table smooth. She thought about the fact that she had student loan deferments, medical expense deferments, a dental appointment she'd been putting off for 8 months because the timing was never right, and that this job she was careful and competent and invisible at, was the thing holding all of it together. Then she picked up the water pitcher and walked to table 7. She refilled Aldous' glass first, then Far's. Then she reached Yeon-ju Oh's side of the table, and she bent slightly, the way the training specified, and she refilled the glass. And then she stayed bent a fraction of a second longer than necessary, and she said, very quietly in Korean, "I'm sorry to interrupt. I want you to know that I understood what was just said about the contract. I believe there are terms on pages 12 and 13 that are not as they've been presented to you." She straightened. Her face was professional and composed. Her hand on the pitcher was completely steady. Yeon-ju Oh looked up at her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, in Korean, so quiet it was nearly under the ambient sound of the dining room, Yeon-ju Oh said, "How much?" "Closer to 45 million, according to what was said. Early termination, once the subsidiary clauses are included." Yeon-ju Oh's expression did not change, not one muscle. But a very slight shift, a deepening, like a surface under which something significant had just moved. She said, in Korean, "Where did you learn to speak like this?" "I studied in Seoul." 2 years. A pause. "Your name?" "Dara." Yeon-ju Oh looked at the document in front of her. She turned to page 12. Aldous had been watching this exchange with the particular expression of a man who is trying to decide whether to be confused or annoyed. "Everything all right?" he asked, with the smile of a man who does not believe anything could possibly not be all right. "Yes," Yeon-ju Oh said in English, clear, composed, unaccented in any direction. "I would simply like a moment to read." The silence that followed was the kind that changes the temperature of a room. Far put his fork down. Aldous opened his mouth, closed it, and reached for his wine. Dara stepped back to the credenza. She stood very still. She was aware that she had just stepped off the edge of something, that there was no version of the next 10 minutes in which she went back to being invisible at table 7. She thought about Thierry. She thought about her rent. She thought about her mother in the hospital bed with the thin green blanket and the 2 bright overhead lights, and the way she always said, "I'm fine, go to work," even when she very clearly wasn't. She thought, "I would do it again." Yeon-ju Oh read pages 12 and 13 twice. Then she set the document flat on the table with both hands. "Mr. Aldous," she said, "I'd like to ask you about the early termination provision." Aldous' smile returned, slower this time. "Of course, it's quite standard. Page 12, section 4, subsection C. The subsidiary trigger that links to the Schedule D definition of material breach. Can you explain how that interacts with the exit penalty calculation on page 13? The smile dimmed. The base penalty, Yeon-ju Oh continued, still in perfect, quiet English, reads as $800,000. But if I'm reading this correctly, and I am reading this correctly, the Schedule D definition expands the scope of material breach to include a decline in portfolio valuation exceeding 12% over any rolling 18-month period. In the current market. She paused. That trigger could be pulled by ordinary market movement, and once it's pulled, the penalty calculation shifts to the subsidiary formula, which would make the actual exposure closer to $45 million. No one spoke. Far was looking at the tablecloth. Aldous' tan had taken on a new quality, less Scottsdale, more fluorescent. "I'd also like to know," Yeon-ju Oh said, "what you said to your colleague approximately 15 minutes ago before the main courses arrived. The comment about what I would or would not read." She looked at him with the patient, unblinking expression of someone who has decided to allow the other person to show them exactly who they are. I think it would be interesting to hear how you characterize that. The room had gone very quiet. Not just table 7, the whole section, the way sound sometimes dips before a shift in weather. Aldous set his wineglass down. He looked at Dara. The look was not kind. "I'd like to speak with the manager," he said. "Of course," Dara said. "I'll get him." She crossed the dining room floor, through the frosted glass door, and she found Thierry at the host stand reviewing the late reservations. She told him, quietly and precisely, what had happened. All of it. She did not soften anything. She watched Thierry's expression go through several stages in rapid succession. Surprise, displeasure, something more complicated, and finally a kind of tight-jawed resolution. "Aldous asked for me," he said. He did. Thierry straightened his jacket. "Go wait in the back." She went. She stood in the narrow corridor between the kitchen and the wine storage, and she looked at the wall, and she breathed. Around her, the kitchen moved in its familiar controlled chaos. The clatter of pans, the quiet instructions, the controlled heat. Her hands, she noticed, were shaking slightly. Just slightly. She pressed them flat against her thighs. 8 minutes passed. Then Thierry came through the door. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then, "Aldous and Farr have been asked to leave." Dara said nothing. "Mrs. Oh has requested that you return to serve the remainder of her meal." He paused. "She also indicated that she would like to speak with you before she leaves if you're willing." "I'm willing," Dara said. Thierry looked at her, really looked at her, the way he hadn't in 3 years of her working here. "You speak Korean?" "Yes, fluently." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll need to know what else you speak. French? Mandarin? Conversational Japanese?" Another pause. "We'll talk," he said. "After service." She went back to table 7. Yeon-ju Oh was sitting alone now, the proposal document closed and set neatly to the side. The halibut was half-eaten. The room had returned to its normal register of quiet conversation and silverware. Dara poured the water. "Thank you," Yeon-ju Oh said in Korean. "I'm glad I could help," Dara said in Korean. "Sit down," Yeon-ju Oh said. Dara glanced around the dining room. The reflex of a woman who has spent 3 years knowing exactly where she's allowed to be. Then she pulled out the chair across from Yeon-ju Oh and sat down. "Tell me about Seoul," Yeon-ju Oh said. So Dara told her. The scholarship, the 2 years at Yonsei, the return to Vancouver when her mother got sick the first time. The law degree that was 3/4 finished and waiting. The deferments, the double shifts, the calculations that had become a permanent background noise in her life. This bill against that shift, this expense against that weekend brunch crowd. She told it plainly, without asking for anything. She was not performing her difficulty. She was just answering a question. Yeon-ju Oh listened without interrupting. When Dara finished, Yeon-ju Oh was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Jeech, Meridian has an office in Vancouver. We opened it 18 months ago. I have been looking for someone to lead our liaison operations for Western Canada." She paused. "The position involves contract review, stakeholder communication, and translation across 3 languages, 2 of which you've just demonstrated. The salary range is listed on our website. I'll tell you, it's in the upper tier of that range for the right candidate." Dara looked at her. "I don't say this because you helped me tonight," Yeon-ju Oh said. "I say this because I've been watching you work for 2 hours. You are precise, you are calm under pressure, and you made a decision tonight that most people in your position would not have made. Those are not small things." She tilted her head slightly. "But the answer can be no. I don't make offers expecting they can't be refused." Dara thought about the Sunday branch shift, about the 8-month dental deferment, about her mother's thin green blanket, about page 12, subsection C, and the $45 million trap that had been dressed up in low six figures and walked through a candlelit room. It's not no, Dara said. Yeon-ju Oh nodded once. The way people nod when something has gone exactly as they thought it would, not because they were arrogant about it, but because they'd learned to trust their own assessment of people. There's one more thing, Yeon-ju Oh said. She reached into her jacket and produced a card, matte black, a single name and number. My assistant will contact you tomorrow about the formal process. But I also want to say this separately, not as part of any offer. She set the card on the table. I know that tonight cost you something, the risk you took. I'd like to cover your mother's treatment costs for the current round. No strings, no relation to the position, just, she paused, choosing the word with the care of a person who doesn't use the easy ones when they won't do, acknowledgement. That what you did was the harder thing, and it mattered. Dara did not speak for a moment. The dining room moved around her, the soft sounds, the candlelight, the polished surfaces, and she sat in the middle of it and felt something she hadn't felt in so long that she'd almost forgotten what to call it. The specific, uncomplicated sensation of being correctly seen. Thank you, she said finally. The words were plain. They were enough. Yeon-ju Oh picked up her water glass and looked out at the room. You should know, she said in English now, with the faintest trace of something that might, in a different setting, have been a smile, that I understood more of what Aldous said than he realized. My English is quite functional. I simply find that people show you more of who they are when they think you can't follow. Dara looked at her. The Toronto office will be very interested in his proposal history, Yeon-ju Oh added. We have good lawyers. She finished her water. She set down the glass. She looked at Dara with a clarity that had nothing performative in it, just the direct, undecorated attention of someone who had built a company, on knowing exactly who was worth knowing. Finish your shift, she said. Go home to your mother and call my assistant tomorrow. Dara stood. She smoothed the front of her apron. She collected the water pitcher from the credenza. She moved back through the dining room, past table 3 and table 5 and the sommelier station, past the frosted glass and the single orchid on every table, through the room that had asked her to be invisible for 3 years. She walked like someone who had stopped pretending that was all she was.